66 million years ago, a mass of rock and metal roughly 10 kilometers in diameter hurled through the vacuum of space, locked on a direct collision course with Earth. The Chicxulub impactor was traveling at tens of thousands of miles per hour, carrying enough kinetic energy to instantly reshape the entire biosphere. But orbital mechanics is fundamentally a game of microscopic variables. If we introduce a slight gravitational nudge from Jupiter millions of years prior, or a minor outgassing event that alters the trajectory of this asteroid by just a fraction of a degree, the ultimate fate of the planet shifts. In this alternative timeline, the celestial body arrives just a few minutes late. It violently grazes the upper atmosphere, painting the dawn sky with a blinding, spectacular meteor procession before disappearing harmlessly into the interstellar void. Today we will explore what would happen if dinosaurs never went extinct. Please like, subscribe, and leave a comment telling us where and when you are watching this video. Down on the surface, the atmosphere does not ignite. There is no hypersonic shockwave, no global rain of molten debris, and no silicate dust cloud to block out the sun and trigger a devastating impact winter. The late Cretaceous period simply carries on. The Earth remains a vibrant greenhouse world, characterized by high sea levels and elevated average global temperatures. The terrestrial ecosystems are in the midst of a profound botanical revolution. Flowering plants, scientifically classified as angiosperms, continue their aggressive colonization of the continents, steadily displacing ancient ferns and conifers to restructure the very foundation of the global food web. Apex predators like Tyrannosaurus rex and massive herbivores like Edmontosaurus do not suddenly collapse into the fossil record. Instead, they wake up to a normal morning, carrying forward an evolutionary momentum that has already dominated the terrestrial realm for 160 million years. The Great Extinction is canceled. However, the absence of a sudden cosmic apocalypse does not mean the Earth remains frozen in time. The tectonic plates are constantly shifting beneath their feet, and the planet is quietly preparing entirely new, slow-burning environmental pressures that will force these magnificent creatures into a radically different future. 10 million years after the asteroid missed Earth, the biosphere encounters a profound planetary bottleneck. This crisis is not born of rock falling from the sky, but of gas rising from the deep. Approximately 56 million years ago, the Earth enters the Paleocene-Eocene Thermal Maximum. Over a geologically brief window of roughly 100,000 years, massive reservoirs of carbon dioxide and methane are violently injected into the atmosphere. The exact trigger remains a subject of intense scientific debate. Some atmospheric models point to immense volcanic fissures opening in the North Atlantic, while competing hypotheses suggest the sudden catastrophic thawing of methane hydrates previously trapped in a frozen state beneath the ocean floor. Regardless of the spark, the result is a runaway greenhouse effect. Global temperatures surge by 5 to 8 degrees Celsius. The oceans acidify, and dense hypertropical rainforests push aggressively northward, eventually taking root on the shores of the Arctic Ocean. For the thriving dinosaur populations, this global hothouse presents a severe biomechanical crisis. In popular media, dinosaurs are often portrayed as creatures perfectly suited for sweltering tropical jungles. However, biological thermodynamics tells a vastly different story. The fundamental problem lies in geometry, specifically the surface area to volume ratio. As an animal grows larger, its volume, which generates internal metabolic heat, increases exponentially faster than its skin surface area, which is the only mechanism available for dissipating that heat. A multi-ton sauropod operating in an environment where ambient temperatures routinely exceed 40 degrees Celsius effectively becomes a trapped biological furnace. It is a simple matter of physics. If a creature cannot dump heat into its surrounding environment faster than its cells generate it, its core temperature rises. Once that core temperature exceeds a strict physiological threshold, cellular proteins begin to denature, leading to irreversible organ failure. For the giants of the Cretaceous, the warming world is rapidly becoming a death sentence. Faced with this planetary oven, the evolutionary pressure on physical size completely reverses. For over 160 million years, immense bulk was the ultimate evolutionary defense mechanism against predation. Now, sheer size is the greatest liability a species can possess. This dramatic shift triggers a biological response that perfectly illustrates a concept known as Bergmann's rule. In modern biology, Bergmann's rule observes that animal populations found in colder climates tend to have larger body masses to conserve heat, while those in warmer regions are significantly smaller to maximize heat dissipation. During the Paleocene-Eocene Thermal Maximum, this rule acts as a ruthless evolutionary filter across the entire dinosaur lineage. We begin to see the widespread phenomenon of extreme evolutionary dwarfing. Lineages of towering titanosaurs, whose ancestors once shaped the landscape with their massive bulk, systematically shrink over thousands of generations. A species of herbivore that once weighed 40 tons might evolve into a dwarf variant no larger than a modern rhinoceros or water buffalo. This is not a sign of biological failure, but a highly successful thermodynamic adaptation. By reducing their mass, these dwarf dinosaurs increase their surface area to volume ratio, allowing them to effectively shed excess heat into the stifling ambient air and survive the greenhouse spikes. But the issue does not stop there. The downsizing of the mega herbivores initiates a cascading collapse across the entire trophic web. The giant apex predators, the massive descendants of the tyrannosaurids, find themselves in an impossible position. Their enormous skulls and immense caloric requirements are highly specialized for taking down massive, slow-moving prey. As their food sources shrink and become more agile, the giant predators must also adapt or face rapid extinction. The fossil record of this alternate timeline would reveal a fascinating parallel evolution. The apex predators become significantly leaner, swifter, and drastically smaller. They shift their hunting strategies from brute force ambush tactics to sustained, high-speed pursuit through the dense, tropical undergrowth. The entire ecosystem recalibrates, scaling down to match the strict thermal limits imposed by the atmosphere. At a planetary scale, the implications of this biological downsizing completely alter our understanding of how complex life responds to atmospheric destabilization. This mechanism is not merely a quirk of Earth's history. It represents a universal thermodynamic law that would apply to any biosphere in the cosmos. When astrobiologists and astronomers search for exoplanets capable of supporting large, complex organisms, they must account for the long-term stability of the host planet's carbon cycle. A sudden atmospheric injection of greenhouse gases acts as a universal metabolic ceiling. If an advanced civilization on another world were to trigger a similar rapid warming event through industrial activity, the very first casualty would be the largest, most energy-demanding fauna. In the context of the Fermi paradox and the search for extraterrestrial intelligence, extreme climatic shifts represent a highly probable candidate for the Great Filter, a planetary threshold that routinely resets biospheres, stripping away massive organisms and favoring only the small, the adaptable, and the thermally efficient. If this physical principle holds true, it tells us that long-term survival on any planet is rarely about sheer physical dominance. It is almost entirely dictated by the efficiency of heat exchange. The dinosaurs survived the Paleocene-Eocene Thermal Maximum not by overpowering their environment, but by yielding to its physical constraints. They abandoned their gigantism to survive the heat. However, shrinking was only a structural response. To truly master this volatile, hypertropical world, they required a more profound internal adaptation. The very engine of their metabolism had to operate differently than anything seen in modern mammals or modern reptiles, pointing toward a unique physiological state that allowed them to cheat the thermal limits of biology entirely. To understand how dinosaurs not only survived but thrived in this super hothouse era, we must dismantle one of the oldest debates in paleontology: the nature of their blood. For over a century, scientists tried to force these animals into two rigid biological boxes. They were assumed to be either sluggish, cold-blooded ectotherms like modern crocodiles, relying entirely on the sun for energy, or they were high-revving, warm-blooded endotherms like modern mammals and birds, burning vast amounts of calories to maintain a constant internal temperature. But the fossil record, written in the microscopic growth rings of dinosaur bones, reveals a much more sophisticated reality. They were neither. They utilized a highly adaptable metabolic strategy known as mesothermy. Mesothermy is the biological equivalent of a hybrid engine. Dinosaurs could generate their own internal body heat through muscle activity and active digestion, allowing them to move fast, hunt aggressively, and maintain high stamina. However, unlike mammals, they did not possess a strict, non-negotiable internal thermostat. Their body temperatures could safely fluctuate to a certain degree with the ambient environment. In a stable, temperate climate, this is simply a useful biological trait. But in the extreme global greenhouse of the Paleocene-Eocene Thermal Maximum, mesothermy became an unparalleled evolutionary superpower. Consider the fatal flaw of being a large mammal in a deeply tropical world. Mammals are obligate endotherms. Their internal biological furnaces are permanently locked in the active position, constantly burning calories to keep their core temperature at roughly 37 degrees Celsius, regardless of the weather outside. When the external environmental temperature rises to 40 degrees Celsius or higher, a large mammal cannot turn off its internal furnace. It is generating massive heat from the inside while being relentlessly baked from the outside, leading to rapid hyperthermia and organ failure. This strict metabolic requirement forces large mammals to consume enormous quantities of food and water just to power their cooling mechanisms, such as panting or sweating. But the issue does not stop there. Dinosaurs, operating as mesotherms, could simply throttle their biological engines down. Because they were not forced to aggressively defend a rigid core temperature, their metabolic rate could dynamically adjust to the crisis. During the hottest parts of the day, their internal heat production would naturally decrease, preventing them from cooking from the inside out. Furthermore, they required significantly less food than a mammal of the exact same size. This energy efficiency was a critical survival advantage in an ecosystem where extreme heat often disrupted plant growth and strained the baseline of the food web. This metabolic flexibility is not merely a theoretical construct of paleobiology. We can observe it today in a very select group of modern animals, such as the great white shark, the leatherback sea turtle, and the echidna. These modern creatures dominate their respective environments precisely because they are not completely tethered to the external temperature like a reptile, nor are they enslaved by an insatiable mammalian appetite. By applying this modern data to the ancient giants, the picture of this alternative Earth comes sharply into focus. The dinosaurs did not just weather the climate crisis. Their internal biology was uniquely pre-configured to exploit it. This leads to a deeper consequence, one that scales far beyond the biology of a single planet. When we consider the fundamental requirements for complex life in the universe, the concept of mesothermy fundamentally alters our parameters for habitable worlds. Astrobiologists often search for exoplanets with highly stable climates, assuming that advanced, highly active organisms require a perfectly regulated environment to support a mammalian-style, warm-blooded metabolism. And right here, this biological mechanism connects to a much larger question. What if obligate warm-bloodedness is actually an evolutionary trap? On a planet with a highly volatile atmosphere, eccentric orbital mechanics, or severe seasonal extremes, a species burdened with an always-on metabolic furnace would quickly face extinction during periods of environmental stress. In the context of the Fermi paradox and the search for extraterrestrial intelligence, mesothermy might be the ultimate, most resilient survival strategy for complex alien life. An extraterrestrial biosphere dominated by mesothermic organisms would be vastly more robust against planetary catastrophes, dramatic climate shifts, and rapid greenhouse spikes. It suggests that if we ever encounter large biological organisms on other worlds, they will likely not function like the dominant mammals of Earth. They will be thermodynamic hybrids, perfectly tuned to the chaos of their home worlds. Armed with this highly efficient metabolic engine, the dinosaurs effectively monopolize the planet's terrestrial energy resources. They could grow larger than any mammalian competitor, consume fewer calories per pound of body weight, and comfortably endure heat waves that would rapidly decimate a purely warm-blooded ecosystem. Their thermodynamic dominance created a closed biological system. The ecological niches for large herbivores, apex predators, and even mid-sized scavengers were utterly saturated by perfectly adapted mesotherms. This absolute ecological lockdown guarantees one profound historical outcome. In this sweltering, hyper-competitive reality, there is absolutely no room for an underdog to rise. The ancient ancestors of modern mammals, those small, furry creatures scurrying in the shadows of the Cretaceous, remained fundamentally trapped. The unyielding biological supremacy of the dinosaurs ensures that these early mammals are forced into a permanent evolutionary exile, living perpetually on the absolute margins of the food web. As the Earth rotates and the sun dips below the horizon, the thermodynamic landscape of the late Cretaceous fundamentally changes. The sprawling forests and river valleys, relentlessly dominated by dinosaurs during the daylight hours, experience a rapid drop in ambient temperature. For the massive mesothermic reptiles, this is a signal to power down. Their internal metabolic engines shift into a lower gear, conserving energy and reducing their need to hunt. It is only in this thermal absence, within the pitch-black shadows of the ancient night, that the ancestors of modern mammals are permitted to exist. But this nocturnal existence is not a temporary evolutionary strategy. It is a permanent biological prison. This severe ecological segregation is known in evolutionary biology as the nocturnal bottleneck. For tens of millions of years, the sheer physical dominance of diurnal or daytime dinosaurs forced all mammalian life into the absolute margins of the ecosystem. To survive the night, early mammals had to completely rewire their sensory architecture, and the legacy of this radical transformation is permanently etched into the genetic code of nearly every mammal alive today. The most profound sacrifice occurred within the eyes. Reptiles and birds possess highly complex retinas packed with cone cells, granting them brilliant tetrachromatic color vision that can even detect ultraviolet light. Mammals, forced into the dark, aggressively discarded these color-detecting cone cells because they are virtually useless without bright sunlight. Instead, they packed their retinas with rod cells, which are highly sensitive to low light, but completely colorblind. This genetic trade-off explains why, in a hypothetical world where dinosaurs never die, mammals remain perpetually colorblind, unable to perceive the vibrant visual spectrum of the daytime world. But the problem does not stop at visual degradation. A creature operating in total darkness cannot rely on sight alone to navigate, forage, or evade predators. The mammalian lineage was forced to overcompensate by drastically enhancing their senses of hearing and smell. Over millions of generations, a remarkable biomechanical migration occurred within their skulls. The small bones at the back of the reptilian jaw gradually detached, shrank, and migrated upward into the skull to form the complex mammalian middle ear. This intricate mechanical amplifier allowed them to hear the faintest rustle of insects in the leaf litter. Simultaneously, their olfactory bulbs expanded massively to map the environment through chemical signatures. Processing this overwhelming flood of auditory and olfactory data required a new kind of computing power. This pressure led directly to the development of the neocortex, a highly advanced brain structure unique to mammals. In a profound evolutionary paradox, the very foundation of mammalian intelligence was forged purely as a survival mechanism for the dark. Operating an advanced, constantly firing brain in the cold night requires an immense amount of biological fuel. This brings us to the extreme metabolic cost of being a mammal. Unlike the mesothermic dinosaurs, mammals became obligate endotherms. They developed internal biological furnaces that burn calories at an astonishing rate, consuming up to 10 times more energy than a similarly sized reptile. This relentless metabolism was the only way to keep their complex nervous systems functioning properly when the ambient temperature dropped. They were forced to spend nearly all their waking hours frantically hunting for high-calorie food, usually insects, simply to avoid freezing to death from the inside out. To survive the daytime, when the giant theropods awoke and the environment became lethally dangerous, mammals had to retreat underground. This subterranean existence imposed severe physical limitations on their body size. The physics of burrowing dictates a hard ceiling on biological growth. As an animal increases in size, the structural integrity of the tunnel required to house it becomes exponentially more unstable, constantly threatening to collapse under the weight of the soil above. Furthermore, subterranean environments suffer from poor atmospheric circulation. The rate of oxygen diffusion into a deep burrow cannot support the metabolic demands of a large, warm-blooded animal. Therefore, the laws of fluid dynamics and soil mechanics ensure that any creature relying on a burrow for daily survival simply cannot grow larger than a modern badger. At a planetary scale, the implications of this ecological lockdown change our entire perspective on the evolution of complex life. We often think of mass extinctions as tragic, destructive events, but the survival of the dinosaurs reveals that a hyper-stable, perfectly optimized ecosystem can be equally devastating to the potential of a biosphere. The dinosaurs achieved such absolute ecological saturation that they formed an impenetrable biological ceiling. And right here, this hypothesis begins to connect with a much larger question regarding the Fermi paradox and the search for extraterrestrial intelligence. Astrobiologists frequently look for planetary catastrophes or technological self-destruction to explain the absence of alien civilizations. But the concept of a permanent biological bottleneck suggests a different kind of great filter. If an alien world is entirely dominated by an early, highly efficient lineage of predators, they might indefinitely suppress the emergence of secondary intelligent species. An advanced, stable biosphere might naturally arrest the development of technological life by forcing potential tool users into a state of permanent, subterranean survival. If this is true, the universe might be filled with lush, vibrant planets teeming with megafauna, where the local equivalent of mammals are trapped in the soil for billions of years, never given the opportunity to look up at the stars. In the continued late Cretaceous period, the mammals are firmly locked in this evolutionary stasis. They are highly specialized biological machines, perfectly engineered to hear a beetle walking on a leaf in total darkness, but completely incapable of rising above the forest floor. They will never invent tools, they will never manipulate fire, and they will never conquer the daylight. They are permanent prisoners of the planetary shadow, completely irrelevant to the grand evolutionary drama playing out on the surface, where the dinosaurs are about to face an entirely new, inescapable predatory arms race. Even if a mammal lineage attempted to break out of its nocturnal subterranean prison, it would immediately crash into an invisible, yet impenetrable, biological wall. It is tempting to imagine a scenario where mammals simply evolved larger bodies over millions of years to fight back and reclaim the daylight. However, evolution does not happen in a vacuum. It happens in a highly contested physical space, a morphospace completely saturated by a specific and utterly lethal class of dinosaur, the small theropods. The dromaeosaurids and troodontids occupied nearly every micro-predatory niche on the planet. These were not the lumbering giants of popular culture. They were hyper-agile, feathered, bipedal pursuit predators ranging from the size of a modern chicken to a wolf. To understand why mammals could never outcompete them, we must look at the biomechanics of their respective respiratory and locomotive systems. Small theropods possessed a highly advanced avian-style respiratory system featuring unidirectional airflow. Unlike the mammalian lung, which must inflate and deflate in an inherently inefficient two-way cycle, the theropod lung continuously pushed fresh, oxygen-rich air through its tissues in a constant, circular loop. This allowed for an extreme aerobic capacity. When combined with a bipedal stance that freed the forelimbs for grasping and drastically increased stride length, these microtheropods were mechanically superior at low to medium body masses. If a random genetic mutation caused a prehistoric mammal to grow larger, perhaps reaching the size of a modern medium-sized dog, it did not gain a survival advantage. Instead, it crossed a fatal threshold. By growing larger, it lost its ability to hide in small crevices or dissipate heat quickly in underground burrows, while simultaneously becoming a massive, highly visible, and calorie-dense target for theropod packs. The mammals were trapped in a classic evolutionary double bind. They were too large to hide, but mechanically too primitive to fight or outrun the established apex predators of that specific weight class. Furthermore, predators like the troodontids possessed exceptionally large eyes with advanced binocular vision and an unusually high encephalization quotient, meaning their brains were highly developed for complex tracking and pack coordination. They were perfect biological gatekeepers. But the issue does not stop there. This absolute niche saturation creates a phenomenon known in ecology as competitive exclusion. In our actual timeline, the asteroid impact erased all non-avian dinosaurs, suddenly emptying the ecological niches for medium and large terrestrial animals. Nature abhors a vacuum, and mammals rapidly exploded in size and diversity to fill it, eventually evolving into everything from wolves to whales. In this alternate timeline, that vacuum never opens. The evolutionary door remains bolted shut from the outside. The continuous, unyielding presence of small theropods acts as a perpetual evolutionary suppressant. This leads to a deeper consequence regarding how we understand the progression of complex life. At a planetary scale, the meaning of this changes completely. We tend to view mass extinctions as entirely destructive events, catastrophic setbacks to the forward march of biological progress. Yet, the eternal suppression of mammals by theropods reveals a profound paradox. Absolute ecological stability is the ultimate enemy of biological innovation. An ecosystem that has reached an optimal equilibrium, where every niche is perfectly occupied by highly specialized organisms, ceases to produce radical new body plans. the biosphere becomes stagnant precisely because it is so successful. And right here, this hypothesis begins to connect with a much larger question in astrobiology and the search for extraterrestrial intelligence. When calculating the odds of alien civilizations through the Drake equation, we often assume that given enough undisturbed time, complex life will inevitably yield intelligent, tool-using species. But the biological lockdown of the late Cretaceous suggests a chilling alternative. What if prolonged planetary stability is actually a great filter? An alien world that never suffers a catastrophic mass extinction might become permanently locked in an optimal, hyper-predatory equilibrium. On such a planet, the local equivalent of mammals, the potential ancestors of a technological civilization, would be forever held down by an unbreakable ceiling of highly evolved, perfectly adapted predators. If this holds true across the cosmos, it means that without the chaotic disruption of a mass extinction to wipe the slate clean, sapiens may never have the physical space to emerge. Destruction is a prerequisite for a technological genesis. On this uninterrupted Earth, the biological ceiling is enforced relentlessly by teeth, claws, and superior oxygen processing. The mammalian lineage will never produce the grand megafauna we know today. There will be no equines galloping across the plains, no felines stalking through the brush, and no primates developing complex social structures in the forest canopy. Mammals are permanently relegated to the status of biological background noise, small, shivering shapes confined to the periphery of existence. Meanwhile, the dinosaurs, having secured absolute dominance over both the giants and the undergrowth, are about to face a completely different kind of existential threat. One not born of predators, but of the very plants they consume. The planet's climate is slowly shifting. The deep forests are receding, and a silent, abrasive botanical revolution is taking root in the soil, preparing to test the limits of dinosaur digestion. As the Cenozoic era marches forward, the relentless thermodynamic engine of the Earth begins to shift its gears. By roughly 30 million years ago, the global hothouse that characterized the Paleocene and Eocene epochs gradually breaks down. Deep beneath the surface, tectonic plates collide with unprecedented force, thrusting the Himalayas into the sky and fundamentally altering global atmospheric circulation and monsoon patterns. Concurrently, the separation of Antarctica from South America opens the Drake Passage, initiating the Antarctic Circumpolar Current. This massive oceanic river effectively thermally isolates the southern continent, triggering the formation of immense ice caps. The resulting drop in global ocean temperatures leads to a dramatic decrease in atmospheric moisture. The Earth is cooling, and more importantly, it is drying out. The dense, unbroken canopy of tropical rainforests that once blanketed the continents begins to fracture and recede, leaving behind vast, arid plains. In this newly exposed, sun-baked morphospace, a minor botanical family initiates a silent, ruthless revolution that will alter the trajectory of life on Earth: the grasses. The spread of grasslands is not merely a change in scenery. It represents one of the most aggressive biological terraforming events in planetary history. Grasses, or the family Poaceae, are a botanical anomaly. Unlike trees and shrubs, which grow from their tips and are easily killed if decapitated by a browsing herbivore, grasses grow from an apical meristem located at or completely below the surface of the soil. This unique anatomy allows them to be endlessly consumed, trampled, and even burned by wildfires, only to rapidly regenerate from their roots. However, surviving consumption is not the same as deterring it. Faced with billions of hungry mesothermic dinosaurs roaming these expanding plains, grasses evolved a devastating defensive mechanism. They weaponized the planet's crust. Through complex biological pathways, grasses actively draw dissolved monosilicic acid from the groundwater, precipitating it within their cellular structures as solid microscopic crystals called phytoliths. Phytoliths are composed of nearly pure silicon dioxide, essentially microscopic shards of glass woven directly into the fabric of the plant. To a grazing herbivore, consuming a mouthful of grass is biomechanically equivalent to chewing on industrial-grade sandpaper. This introduces a fatal mechanical crisis for the dominant herbivores. The physics of the problem are inescapable and dictate a harsh reality based on the Mohs scale of mineral hardness. Tooth enamel, constructed primarily of biological hydroxyapatite, has a hardness of roughly 5. Silica possesses a hardness of 7. In any physical system where a softer material repeatedly grinds against a harder material, the softer material will be systematically destroyed. For an animal attempting to survive entirely on a diet of grass, the sheer volume of silica ingested rapidly shears away the crown of the tooth, exposing the sensitive pulp and nerve cavity underneath. In a matter of months, a poorly adapted herbivore will literally grind its teeth down to the gum line, resulting in a slow, agonizing death by starvation, surrounded by an ocean of food it can no longer process. But the issue does not stop there. The ecological dominance of grasses creates a profound planetary feedback loop that accelerates the Earth's cooling. Grasslands possess a significantly higher surface albedo than dark forest canopies, meaning they reflect a larger percentage of solar radiation back into space, rather than absorbing it as heat. Furthermore, grasses construct immense deep root networks, rhizomes, that constantly pump carbon from the atmosphere deep into the soil. When the grass dies or is burned, a vast portion of that carbon remains securely locked underground. The biosphere itself is now actively scrubbing greenhouse gases from the atmosphere, plunging the planet further into a cooler, drier state. At a planetary scale, the meaning of this botanical arms race changes completely. It demonstrates that biospheres do not passively inhabit a geological environment. They actively exploit it to balance biological consumption. And right here, this concept connects with a much larger question regarding astrobiology and the modeling of extraterrestrial ecosystems. When astronomers model habitable exoplanets, they often focus purely on organic chemistry and the presence of liquid water. However, the evolution of phytoliths suggests that advanced alien flora would inevitably incorporate the local lithosphere, the planetary crust, into their biological defenses. If an alien world is rich in different surface minerals, an extraterrestrial grassland might be laced with microscopic crystals of iron oxide, titanium, or other highly abrasive compounds to deter native megafauna. It implies that to survive long-term on any rocky planet, a successful herbivorous species must eventually evolve a mechanism to process raw geology. In the reality of our actual timeline, the sudden emergence of this silica-laced landscape acted as a brutal evolutionary filter. It drove countless lineages of early low-crowned mammals to immediate extinction, strongly favoring only those rare ungulates that managed to evolve highly specialized ever-growing teeth, like modern horses and cows. But in this alternate timeline, the sweeping grasslands are not met by primitive mammals. They are met by the descendants of the ceratopsians and the hadrosaurs. To conquer this abrasive new world, the dinosaurs will not need to slowly invent a new type of tooth. They will unleash a latent biological technology that they had been perfecting for nearly 100 million years, turning the ultimate botanical weapon completely obsolete. To process the hyper-abrasive, silica-laced grasslands that rapidly conquered the cooling Earth, any herbivore attempting to survive must overcome a brutal mechanical barrier. In our actual timeline, the primitive mammals of the Miocene epoch suffered a massive extinction event, because their teeth simply ground away to nothing. It took millions of years of agonizing evolutionary pressure for a few surviving ungulates, like the ancestors of modern horses, to develop hypsodonty, elongated teeth that slowly push out of the jawbone to compensate for continuous wear. But the herbivorous dinosaurs of this alternative timeline do not need to endure millions of years of starvation to adapt. They are already equipped with an evolutionary cheat code, a biological mechanism perfected during the late Cretaceous that renders the botanical weapon of silica completely obsolete. The dental battery. The ornithischian dinosaurs, particularly the ceratopsians like Triceratops and the hadrosaurs, or duck-billed dinosaurs, possessed a jaw architecture that has no equivalent in the modern mammalian world. Mammals are strictly limited in their dental replacement. We get 2 sets of teeth in a lifetime. Dinosaurs, however, replaced their teeth continuously. But the hadrosaurs took this baseline reptilian trait and engineered it into a biomechanical masterpiece. A single hadrosaur jaw did not contain a flat row of individual teeth. It housed a tightly packed interlocking grid of up to 1,000 individual teeth, stacked vertically in deep magazines within the skull. As the animal chewed the tough, abrasive grasses, the uppermost layer of teeth acted as a continuous, self-sharpening rasp. When the silica shards inevitably pulverized the enamel of the active chewing surface, it simply did not matter. A fresh, fully formed tooth was already seamlessly pushing up from the vascular tissue below, acting as an endless conveyor belt of enamel. They did not just chew their food, they pulverized it through a highly efficient, industrial-grade biological shredder. But the issue does not stop at the mechanics of chewing. The existence of the dental battery reveals a profound principle about how complex life navigates planetary transitions. In evolutionary biology, this is known as exaptation, or pre-adaptation. The hadrosaurs did not evolve the dental battery to eat grass. They evolved it tens of millions of years earlier to grind up tough, fibrous cycads and pine needles. Yet, when the global environment drastically shifted and grasses weaponized the crust with silicon dioxide, this ancient legacy hardware proved to be the perfect countermeasure. At a planetary scale, the meaning of this changes our understanding of extinction filters. When astrobiologists consider the longevity of potential alien biospheres, there is often an assumption that species must rapidly mutate to survive sudden environmental cataclysms. However, the dinosaurian dental battery suggests that survival through a planetary bottleneck is often dictated by pure biological luck, having the right ancestral architecture installed long before the crisis ever begins. If an extraterrestrial ecosystem faces a sudden atmospheric or botanical shift, the species that inherit the new world will not necessarily be the most advanced, but rather those holding legacy traits that coincidentally align with the new physical parameters of the planet. Once the abrasive grass is successfully pulverized in the mouth, the dinosaurs face the second, far more difficult barrier of a grassland diet: chemistry. Grass is composed primarily of cellulose, a complex carbohydrate structured with rigid beta-acetyl linkages. There is no vertebrate animal on Earth capable of producing the digestive enzymes required to break down cellulose independently. To extract calories from this locked biological vault, the herbivorous dinosaurs had to completely restructure their internal anatomy, outsourcing their digestion to an entirely different kingdom of life. The giant herbivores evolved massive, highly specialized fermentation chambers within their digestive tracts, operating as walking, multi-ton bioreactors. Inside these colossal organs, the chewed grass was soaked in an oxygen-deprived environment and subjected to trillions of symbiotic anaerobic bacteria and protozoa. It is through this microscopic alliance that the cellulose is finally fractured into volatile fatty acids, which the dinosaur's body can readily absorb. This reliance on a massive internal microbiome completely alters the physical shape of the animal. To house these enormous vats, the evolutionary pressure pushes the herbivores back toward immense bulk, creating towering, wide-bodied grazers that slowly navigate the plains like immense biological dreadnoughts. This leads to a deeper consequence, one that loops perfectly back to the thermodynamic advantages of the dinosaurs. The process of bacterial fermentation in a massive internal chamber is highly exothermic. It generates a tremendous amount of passive metabolic heat. For a purely warm-blooded mammal, excess heat from digestion in a warm climate can be a fatal liability, forcing the animal to waste water and energy trying to cool down. But for the mesothermic dinosaurs, navigating a rapidly cooling global climate, this internal furnace is an unparalleled advantage. As the Earth's temperature drops, these giant herbivores do not need to burn vast amounts of stored fat to stay warm. Their food literally digests itself and heats them from the inside out, providing a continuous, calorie-free thermal buffer against the chilling winds of the open plains. And exactly here, this localized digestive chemistry scales up to impact the entire celestial body. The byproduct of this immense bacterial fermentation is methane gas. When you have tens of millions of multi-ton dinosaurs acting as mobile fermentation vats across the expanding global grasslands, the sheer volume of methane exhaled and expelled into the atmosphere becomes a dominant geological force. Methane is a potent greenhouse gas, vastly more efficient at trapping solar radiation than carbon dioxide. If this model is correct, it means the biology of the dinosaurs actively fought against the geology of the planet. As tectonic shifts and the expansion of grasses attempted to plunge the Earth into a deep freeze, the collective digestive exhaust of the mega herbivores effectively insulated the atmosphere, artificially stabilizing the global climate and drastically delaying the onset of the incoming ice ages. It proves that in a mature, fully saturated biosphere, life is no longer a passenger on a geological stage. It becomes the thermostat of the world. However, even the combined digestive output of 1 billion dinosaurs could not hold back the orbital mechanics of the Earth forever. The glaciers were inevitably coming, and to survive the impending freeze, the dinosaurs would have to activate dormant genetic code that would forever alter their physical appearance. By 2.5 million years ago, the immense biological thermostat created by the digestive methane of global herbivore populations finally reaches its absolute limit. It is overpowered by the sheer, unyielding mechanics of the solar system. Deep tectonic shifts force the landmass of South America to collide with North America, closing the Isthmus of Panama and severing the warm equatorial ocean currents that once circulated freely around the globe. Combine this massive geographical shift with cyclical variations in the Earth's orbit and axial tilt, known in astrophysics as Milankovitch cycles, and the planet's thermodynamic balance permanently shatters. The Pleistocene epoch begins. Vast sheets of solid ice, some up to 3 kilometers thick, march southward from the Arctic, relentlessly grinding across the continents. For the dominant mesothermic dinosaurs, the plunging temperatures present a brutal physical crisis. Mesothermy, the highly flexible metabolic engine that saved them during the hypertropical greenhouse eras, now faces its ultimate thermodynamic test. A mesotherm can efficiently throttle down its internal heat production to survive a heat wave, but in a sub-zero glaciated environment, the physics of survival completely invert. The animal must generate internal heat and critically trap that heat before it bleeds out into the freezing ambient air. If a multi-ton creature loses core temperature faster than its cells can metabolize fuel, its biological furnace collapses, leading to rapid cellular freezing and death. The laws of fluid dynamics and heat transfer demand a physical barrier. While the primitive mammals scurrying in the dark rely on simple hair, the dinosaurs are about to deploy a biological technology that is structurally vastly superior. They do not need to wait millions of years for random genetic mutations to invent a new insulating layer from scratch. The biological blueprint is already fully written and stored deep within their evolutionary history. Hundreds of millions of years prior, early dinosaurs developed simple, hair-like filamentous structures called protofeathers, initially utilized for visual display and minor temperature regulation. While many of the giant species in the subsequent hothouse eras suppressed these specific genes to remain scaly and maximize heat dissipation, the underlying genetic code was never completely deleted. It was simply archived in the background of their deoxyribonucleic acid. As the planetary temperature plummets, the extreme environmental stress triggers a massive epigenetic cascade. The dormant genetic switches flip back to the active position, instructing their bodies to rapidly produce dense integumentary coverage. The resulting adaptation is not the rigid aerodynamic flight feather we see on modern birds, but an incredibly dense, highly complex down. To understand why this is an evolutionary masterstroke, we must look at the strict physics of thermal conductivity. A dinosaurian feather is a fractal structure. Its central shaft branches into barbs, which further split into microscopic barbules that hook and lock together. This microscopic architecture traps a boundary layer of perfectly stagnant air directly against the animal's skin. Because ambient air is an exceptionally poor conductor of thermal energy, this trapped layer effectively isolates the internal core temperature from the freezing external environment. Mammalian fur traps air in a linear, relatively disorganized fashion, but dinosaurian down locks it into a highly efficient geometric matrix. When you combine this advanced insulation with the immense physical bulk of the herbivores, a concept known as thermal inertia, these creatures essentially become closed thermodynamic systems, losing almost zero energy to the icy winds. The visual reality of this adaptation completely shatters our traditional understanding of ancient megafauna. The fossil record of this alternative ice age would reveal towering, heavily insulated biological dreadnoughts. Giant ceratopsians and massive tyrannosaurids do not perish in the frost. They thrive in it. They evolve coats of dense, shaggy protofeathers up to a foot thick. Furthermore, the evolutionary pressure of the snow-covered landscape drives a rapid, aggressive shift in pigmentation. Natural selection strongly favors individuals with suppressed melanin production. A giant predator missing a hunt in sub-zero temperatures faces a massive, potentially fatal deficit in metabolic energy, making stealth a physical necessity. This results in apex predators cloaked in absolute white or pale gray, turning them into colossal phantom hunters perfectly camouflaged against the blinding blizzards. And exactly here, this genetic mechanism connects to a much larger question regarding astrobiology and the longevity of life in the cosmos. When astronomers evaluate the habitability of exoplanets, they often discard worlds with highly eccentric orbits, assuming that extreme, cyclical freeze-thaw phases would repeatedly sterilize the surface. However, the dinosaurian response to the Pleistocene reveals that a mature biosphere does not forget its past. The existence of archived genetic traits, often dismissed by early geneticists as non-coding or junk sequences, actually acts as a planetary survival vault. If we ever discover complex life on a world with a chaotic climate, its survival will likely depend on this exact mechanism: the ability to rapidly access and deploy millions of years of dormant evolutionary data to physically rebuild the species in real time. It suggests that biological resilience is not just about current physical adaptation, it is heavily dictated by the depth of a species' genetic memory. In the context of the Fermi paradox, a civilization or a biosphere trying to survive the deep time of the universe must possess a genome deep enough to remember how to survive a frozen world. The species that conquer the stars might simply be those that have the most extensive biological archives, but the problem does not stop at surviving the atmospheric cold. At a planetary scale, the consequences of a global ice age fundamentally alter the physical geography of the Earth itself. As the advancing glaciers lock up millions of cubic kilometers of liquid water, the oceans begin to rapidly drain. Global sea levels plummet by hundreds of feet. In doing so, the receding waters expose vast, fertile stretches of the continental shelf, raising massive land bridges across what were once deep, impassable ocean straits. The Earth is no longer a collection of isolated land masses separated by the tectonic drift of the Cretaceous. The ancient geographical barriers that forced the distinct dinosaur lineages to evolve in isolation for tens of millions of years are suddenly removed, setting the ultimate stage for a violent global biological collision. As the massive continental ice sheets lock up millions of cubic miles of liquid water, the global oceans rapidly retreat, exposing the submerged continental shelves. The most critical of these newly revealed landscapes is Beringia, a colossal stretch of arid, freezing tundra connecting Siberia to Alaska. This is not a bridge of ice, but a vast expanse of dry, exposed earth, swept by freezing winds and anchored by resilient, silica-rich grasses. For tens of millions of years, the Pacific Ocean acted as an impenetrable biological quarantine, allowing the dinosaur lineages of Asia and North America to evolve in total isolation. Now, the thermodynamics of the Ice Age have completely drained the moat. The physical barrier is gone, replacing millions of years of separation with a continuous intercontinental highway. Stepping onto this frozen expanse are the ultimate thermodynamic survivors of the Pleistocene, the giant woolly dinosaurs. Having fully activated their dormant genetic codes for complex protofeathers, these creatures undergo a radical physical transformation. The descendants of the ancient tyrannosaurs and massive ornithischians are no longer sleek, scaly reptiles of the tropical hothouse. They emerge as towering, heavily insulated behemoths, draped in thick layers of dense, shaggy down. This structural adaptation fundamentally exploits the geometry of heat retention. By combining immense physical bulk with a high-performance insulating layer, they maximize their thermal inertia. The cold air simply cannot penetrate the boundary layer of trapped air within their feathers, allowing them to endure temperatures far below freezing without drastically increasing their caloric intake. They become walking fortresses of retained biological heat. To traverse the deep snow and solid ice, these giant woolly dinosaurs must also restructure their lower extremities. Evolution strips away the heavy, fleshy footpads of the Cretaceous, replacing them with broad, snowshoe-like structures covered in thick, keratinized scales to distribute their immense weight over the fragile ice crust. Furthermore, they develop complex countercurrent heat exchange systems within their circulatory networks. The arteries carrying warm, oxygenated blood from the heart run directly parallel to the veins returning cold blood from the feet. This highly localized thermal transfer ensures that the core body heat is actively conserved, rather than bled out into the freezing permafrost through their extremities. It is a masterpiece of biological engineering, allowing multi-ton organisms to thrive in a deep freeze. But the issue does not stop at simple thermal survival. The opening of the land bridges triggers one of the most violent ecological reshufflings in planetary history, a phenomenon known as a biotic interchange. When two previously isolated biospheres suddenly collide, the results are rarely peaceful. ecosystems that have spent millions of years optimizing their internal predator and prey dynamics are instantly thrown into absolute chaos. Apex predators from the Asian continent, possessing highly evolved pack hunting strategies and superior olfactory tracking, cross over into the Americas. They encounter massive herds of herbivorous dinosaurs that possess completely naive defense mechanisms, having never evolved to counter this specific type of neurological threat. While Beringia connects the frozen north, a similarly profound geological event occurs closer to the equator. The volcanic uplift of the Isthmus of Panama finally bridges the deep oceanic trench between North and South America. For tens of millions of years, the southern continent operated as a massive, isolated island laboratory, dominated by entirely distinct lineages of gargantuan titanosaurs and bizarre apex predators. When the Panamanian land bridge solidifies, the northern predators sweep southward, while the heavily armored herbivores of the south march north. This is not merely a migration. It is a full-scale biological war for trophic dominance. It creates an intense continental-scale evolutionary arms race, driving rapid extinction for those unable to adapt, while forcing the survivors to mutate and evolve at an accelerated, almost frantic pace. At a planetary scale, the meaning of this intercontinental migration completely changes our perspective on how advanced biospheres are forged. We often view the shifting of tectonic plates and the rising and falling of sea levels as random geological background noise. However, this dynamic cycle of extreme isolation, followed by sudden, violent reunification, is arguably the most powerful engine for biological innovation ever discovered. When astrobiologists scan the galaxy for habitable exoplanets, they frequently look for the presence of liquid water and stable atmospheres. But this mechanism suggests a much more stringent requirement. A planet must possess a highly active tectonic system capable of routinely shifting ocean basins to repeatedly fracture and recombine its landmasses. And right here, this geological mechanism begins to connect with a much larger question regarding the Fermi paradox and the longevity of technological civilizations. If an alien world is entirely covered by a single unbroken landmass, or conversely, a single endless ocean, its biosphere would never experience this planetary mechanism of forced geographic isolation, followed by sudden integration. Without the planetary pressure cooker of a biotic interchange to test and refine species against entirely foreign ecosystems, evolution on that world might reach a stagnant equilibrium. It might never produce the complex, highly adaptable neural architectures required to build a technological civilization. The giant woolly dinosaurs migrating across the freezing bridges of the Pleistocene demonstrate that a biosphere needs a fractured, shifting planet to truly test the extreme limits of its genetic potential. The Ice Age did not just freeze the Earth, it aggressively shuffled the biological deck, ensuring that only the most neurologically and physically adaptable species would survive the coming epochs. And while the towering feathered giants dominated the frozen Earth below, a completely different battle for ecological supremacy, governed by the strict laws of aerodynamics, was unfolding in the freezing skies above. While the ground below is violently reshaped by migrating behemoths and advancing glaciers, the sky above operates under a completely different set of physical laws. If we look upward in this uninterrupted timeline, we do not see flocks of giant eagles or massive albatrosses dominating the thermals. The open atmosphere remains the absolute, uncontested domain of a lineage that had already mastered powered flight tens of millions of years before the first bird ever left the ground. The pterosaurs. It is a common misconception to classify pterosaurs as dinosaurs. They are a distinct parallel group of flying reptiles. And in the absence of the Cretaceous extinction event, the most massive among them, the Ajdarchids, do not merely survive. They permanently lock avian dinosaurs, the ancestors of modern birds, into a highly restrictive aerodynamic prison. To understand why birds could never overthrow the pterosaurs, we must examine the brutal biomechanics of getting a physical mass airborne. The conflict between these two lineages is not a matter of aggression, but of structural engineering, specifically the physics of the launch phase. Modern birds and their Cretaceous ancestors utilize a bipedal launch mechanism. To take off, a bird relies entirely on the explosive muscular power of its hind legs to push against the earth, overcoming the initial force of gravity before its wings can generate sufficient lift. This creates a severe evolutionary bottleneck. As a bird evolves to be larger and heavier, its leg muscles must grow exponentially more massive just to achieve that initial jump. However, once the bird is in the air, those massive leg muscles become completely useless dead weight. The structural limit of this bipedal design dictates that a flying bird simply cannot exceed a certain weight class, roughly 20 to 30 kilograms in our actual timeline, before gravity firmly grounds it. The pterosaurs, conversely, bypassed this aerodynamic ceiling entirely. They utilized a quadrupedal launch mechanism. A giant pterosaur, standing as tall as a modern giraffe, did not jump with its hind legs. Instead, it used its massive, highly muscular forelimbs, the exact same limbs it used to fly, to essentially pole vault itself into the air. In this biological design, the flight engine and the launch engine are the exact same mechanism. There is almost zero dead weight. This biomechanical cheat code allowed pterosaurs to achieve wingspans exceeding 12 meters and body masses well over 200 kilograms, pushing the absolute physical limits of how large an organism can be and still maintain powered flight in Earth's atmospheric pressure. Because they possess this structural monopoly on size, the giant pterosaurs permanently occupy all the mega-aerial ecological niches. They are the supreme gliders of the open oceans, utilizing immense wings to ride thermal currents for thousands of miles with minimal energy expenditure. They are the apex scavengers of the frozen plains, capable of spotting a carcass from miles above and aggressively driving off smaller terrestrial predators once they land. Faced with these colossal airplane-sized shadows patrolling the open skies, the evolutionary path for birds is forcefully redirected. Denied the ability to grow large, birds are forced to hyper-specialize in the exact environments where massive wingspans are a lethal liability. The dense, complex architecture of the forest canopy. But the issue does not stop at simple habitat segregation. This morphological lock-in dictates the entire neurological future of the avian lineage. An animal restricted to flying at high speeds through tight, unpredictable forest environments requires an extraordinarily rapid processing speed. Because they cannot invest biological energy into physical size, birds channel it into neural density. They develop exceptionally complex brains, packing more neurons per square inch than any mammalian equivalent. In this alternate Earth, birds become the ultimate aerial acrobats and cognitive puzzle solvers, developing deep social structures, complex vocal languages, and advanced tool use. They rule the complex microspaces of the world, while the pterosaurs reign over the macrospaces. At a planetary scale, the meaning of this aerial stratification completely changes our understanding of atmospheric biology. It demonstrates that the rules of powered flight are not mere biological suggestions. They are rigid mathematical constants dictated by fluid dynamics and gravitational pull. And precisely here, this physical constraint connects with a much larger question regarding the search for extraterrestrial life. When astrobiologists model potential fauna on exoplanets, they must apply these exact same aerodynamic laws. If we discover an alien world with a gravity and atmospheric density similar to Earth's, we can confidently predict that its largest flying organisms will not look or function like birds, they will invariably utilize a quadrupedal launch system. Conversely, if we find a planet with significantly lower gravity or a vastly thicker atmosphere, the aerodynamic ceiling is artificially raised, potentially allowing bipedal launch organisms to reach staggering, monstrous proportions. The physical structure of a planet's atmosphere permanently dictates the anatomical blueprints of the creatures that can navigate it. It suggests that across the universe, the shape of a wing and the method of taking flight are universally standardized by physics, long before biology ever takes over. In this uninterrupted Cenozoic era, the sky is permanently partitioned. The giant pterosaurs soar endlessly above the expanding ice sheets and sweeping grasslands, acting as the undisputed titans of the wind, while the highly intelligent smaller birds dart through the remaining forests like biological fighter jets. Yet, while the open air and the solid continents are locked in these complex, deeply entrenched evolutionary standoffs, the largest contiguous habitat on the planet remains untouched by the freezing winds. Plunging below the surface of the waves, we enter a dark, high-pressure realm where a completely different set of ancient monsters refuses to surrender their thrones, permanently altering the destiny of the world's oceans. While the ground below is violently reshaped by migrating behemoths and advancing glaciers, the sky above operates under a completely different set of physical laws. If we look upward in this uninterrupted timeline, we do not see flocks of giant eagles or massive albatrosses dominating the thermals. The open atmosphere remains the absolute, uncontested domain of a lineage that had already mastered powered flight tens of millions of years before the first bird ever left the ground, the pterosaurs. It is a common misconception to classify pterosaurs as dinosaurs. They are a distinct parallel group of flying reptiles. And in the absence of the Cretaceous extinction event, the most massive among them, the Ajdarchids, do not merely survive. They permanently lock avian dinosaurs, the ancestors of modern birds, into a highly restrictive aerodynamic prison. To understand why birds could never overthrow the pterosaurs, we must examine the brutal biomechanics of getting a physical mass airborne. The conflict between these two lineages is not a matter of aggression, but of structural engineering, specifically the physics of the launch phase. Modern birds and their Cretaceous ancestors utilize a bipedal launch mechanism. To take off, a bird relies entirely on the explosive muscular power of its hind legs to push against the earth, overcoming the initial force of gravity before its wings can generate sufficient lift. This creates a severe evolutionary bottleneck. As a bird evolves to be larger and heavier, its leg muscles must grow exponentially more massive just to achieve that initial jump. However, once the bird is in the air, those massive leg muscles become completely useless dead weight. The structural limit of this bipedal design dictates that a flying bird simply cannot exceed a certain weight class, roughly 20 to 30 kilograms in our actual timeline, before gravity firmly grounds it. The pterosaurs, conversely, bypass this aerodynamic ceiling entirely. They utilized a quadrupedal launch mechanism. A giant pterosaur, standing as tall as a modern giraffe, did not jump with its hind legs. Instead, it used its massive, highly muscular forelimbs, the exact same limbs it used to fly, to essentially pole vault itself into the air. In this biological design, the flight engine and the launch engine are the exact same mechanism. There is almost zero dead weight. This biomechanical cheat code allowed pterosaurs to achieve wingspans exceeding 12 meters and body masses well over 200 kilograms, pushing the absolute physical limits of how large an organism can be and still maintain powered flight in Earth's atmospheric pressure. Because they possess this structural monopoly on size, the giant pterosaurs permanently occupy all the mega-aerial ecological niches. They are the supreme gliders of the open oceans, utilizing immense wings to ride thermal currents for thousands of miles with minimal energy expenditure. They are the apex scavengers of the frozen plains, capable of spotting a carcass from miles above and aggressively driving off smaller terrestrial predators once they land. Faced with these colossal, airplane-sized shadows patrolling the open skies, the evolutionary path for birds is forcefully redirected. Denied the ability to grow large, birds are forced to hyper-specialize in the exact environments where massive wingspans are a lethal liability: the dense, complex architecture of the forest canopy. But the issue does not stop at simple habitat segregation. This morphological lock-in dictates the entire neurological future of the avian lineage. An animal restricted to flying at high speeds through tight, unpredictable forest environments requires an extraordinarily rapid processing speed. Because they cannot invest biological energy into physical size, birds channel it into neural density. They develop exceptionally complex brains, packing more neurons per square inch than any mammalian equivalent. In this alternate Earth, birds become the ultimate aerial acrobats and cognitive puzzle solvers, developing deep social structures, complex vocal languages, and advanced tool use. They rule the complex microspaces of the world, while the pterosaurs reign over the macrospaces. At a planetary scale, the meaning of this aerial stratification completely changes our understanding of atmospheric biology. It demonstrates that the rules of powered flight are not mere biological suggestions. They are rigid mathematical constants dictated by fluid dynamics and gravitational pull. And precisely here, this physical constraint connects with a much larger question regarding the search for extraterrestrial life. When astrobiologists model potential fauna on exoplanets, they must apply these exact same aerodynamic laws. If we discover an alien world with a gravity and atmospheric density similar to Earth's, we can confidently predict that its largest flying organisms will not look or function like birds. They will invariably utilize a quadrupedal launch system. Conversely, if we find a planet with significantly lower gravity or a vastly thicker atmosphere, the aerodynamic ceiling is artificially raised, potentially allowing bipedal launch organisms to reach staggering, monstrous proportions. The physical structure of a planet's atmosphere permanently dictates the anatomical blueprints of the creatures that can navigate it. It suggests that across the universe, the shape of a wing and the method of taking flight are universally standardized by physics, long before biology ever takes over. In this uninterrupted Cenozoic era, the sky is permanently partitioned. The giant pterosaurs soar endlessly above the expanding ice sheets and sweeping grasslands, acting as the undisputed titans of the wind, while the highly intelligent smaller birds dart through the remaining forests like biological fighter jets. Yet, while the open air and the solid continents are locked in these complex, deeply entrenched evolutionary standoffs, the largest contiguous habitat on the planet remains untouched by the freezing winds. Plunging below the surface of the waves, we enter a dark, high-pressure realm where a completely different set of ancient monsters refuses to surrender their thrones, permanently altering the destiny of the world's oceans. As we project the evolutionary trajectory of the dinosaurs deep into the Cenozoic era, we inevitably confront the most controversial and deeply entrenched bias in human scientific thought: the nature of high intelligence. In 1982, a prominent paleontologist named Dale Russell introduced a highly provocative thought experiment that would permanently infect pop culture and speculative biology. He examined the fossil record of the troodontids, a family of small, exceptionally agile theropods from the late Cretaceous, possessing unusually large brain-to-body mass ratios and forward-facing eyes. Russell hypothesized that if the extinction event had never occurred, the relentless pressure of natural selection would have driven these highly encephalized dinosaurs toward a radically different physical form. He called this hypothetical descendant the Dinosauroid. The Dinosauroid was presented as a bizarre, scaly mirror image of humanity. Russell envisioned a creature that had completely abandoned its horizontal posture to stand perfectly upright. To achieve this, it supposedly shed its long balancing tail, shifted to a flat-footed plantigrade stance, and developed a large domed skull to house an ever-expanding brain. It possessed opposable thumbs and forward-facing vision, essentially operating as a reptilian hominid. For decades, this model shaped the public perception of what advanced, non-mammalian intelligence must look like. However, modern evolutionary developmental biology aggressively dismantles this concept. The Dinosauroid is not a product of rigorous scientific extrapolation. It is a profound manifestation of anthropocentrism, the flawed assumption that the human body plan is the ultimate, inevitable pinnacle of all evolutionary progress. To understand why a highly intelligent dinosaur would never evolve into a humanoid shape, we must examine the unforgiving mechanics of anatomy. Evolution does not operate with an end goal in mind, and it absolutely does not scrap highly successful functional architecture to mimic a completely unrelated lineage. The fundamental theropod body plan, a horizontal spine balanced perfectly over a bipedal fulcrum by a rigid muscular tail, is not a primitive stepping stone. It is an absolute masterpiece of biomechanical engineering. The theropod tail is not merely a useless appendage waiting to be discarded. It is the structural anchor for the caudofemoralis, the massive retractor muscle that powers the hind legs. To force a theropod to stand perfectly upright like a primate, evolution would have to systematically dismantle tens of millions of years of perfectly optimized locomotive machinery. The creature would lose its speed, its balance, and its energetic efficiency. The human body plan, with its vertical spine and balancing issues, is actually a highly compromised, localized solution specifically tailored for a lineage of arboreal apes forced to navigate the tall grasses of the African savanna. It is a biological quirk, not a universal prerequisite for intelligence. But the issue does not stop at skeletal mechanics. It extends deep into the architecture of the brain itself. The Dinosauroid hypothesis assumed that to become vastly more intelligent, a dinosaur would require a massive, bulbous skull to house a complex, folded mammalian neocortex. This fundamentally ignores the parallel neurological reality of the avian lineage. Modern neurological imaging reveals that birds, the direct descendants of theropods, do not possess a neocortex at all. Instead, they process complex cognitive tasks through a completely different brain structure known as the pallium. The avian pallium operates under a completely different set of spatial rules. It packs neurons at a drastically higher density than any mammalian brain. A modern corvid, such as a crow or a raven, possesses a brain the size of a walnut, yet exhibits problem-solving capabilities, tool fabrication skills, and an understanding of water displacement that rivals or exceeds that of a 7-year-old human child. Therefore, a highly advanced dinosaur of the Cenozoic era would not require a giant, top-heavy human-like head. It could achieve profound human-level sapience within a standard aerodynamic theropod skull, simply by maximizing the neural density of its pallium. And right here, this biological reality begins to connect with a much larger question regarding astrobiology and the search for extraterrestrial intelligence. When astronomers and SETI researchers scan the galaxy for technological signatures, they must constantly battle the human bias that intelligent aliens will look somewhat like us. The absolute failure of the dinosauroid concept demonstrates that even on our own planet, the human form is an extreme evolutionary anomaly. If we extrapolate this to the cosmos, the implications are staggering. The humanoid shape is likely an incredibly rare geographic accident confined to Earth. If we discover a spacefaring civilization on a distant exoplanet, they will almost certainly not be bipedal humanoids. They could be highly encephalized, horizontal bipeds like the theropods, radially symmetrical cephalopods navigating a subsurface ocean, or mesothermic quadrupeds that manipulate tools through highly complex modified mandibles. By recognizing that high intelligence does not demand a human face, we drastically expand the parameters of what an advanced civilization might look like. If this is true, it not only rewrites the past of the Earth, but also redefines the future of all potential technological civilizations. The universe is not waiting for humanoids to build starships. It is waiting for whichever localized body plan manages to cross the threshold of complex tool use. On this uninterrupted Earth, the most intelligent creatures on the planet do not construct their societies by standing upright. They remain perfectly horizontal, balancing on powerful digitigrade legs, utilizing their razor-sharp beaks and highly dexterous, three-fingered claws to interact with the world. They do not look like us, but as we are about to see, the way they perceive their environment, manipulate objects, and communicate across vast distances suggests a level of cognitive sophistication that fundamentally challenges our definition of what it means to be a sentient being. Having discarded the anthropocentric illusion of the humanoid dinosaur, we must construct a highly realistic model of how advanced reptilian intelligence actually operates in the wild. If the heavily encephalized descendants of the dromaeosaurs and troodontids are not building forge fires and smelting iron, how does their vast cognitive capacity manifest? The answer lies not in industrial architecture, but in the absolute mastery of social geometry and biological manipulation. The true measure of their intelligence is expressed through hyper-coordinated pack behavior, fundamentally driven by a cognitive mechanism known as the theory of mind. In evolutionary biology and psychology, the theory of mind is the ability to attribute mental states, beliefs, intents, desires, and knowledge to oneself and to others, and to understand that others have beliefs and intentions that are different from one's own. For a pack of small, highly intelligent theropods hunting a heavily armored multi-ton herbivore, instinct alone is insufficient. They must execute complex, multi-stage tactical maneuvers. This requires an individual predator to accurately predict not only the evasive movements of the prey, but also the exact positioning and intended actions of its packmates without direct line of sight. They operate as a decentralized neural network. Modern wolves and orcas exhibit basic forms of this, but an avian-style pallium, packed with a vastly higher density of neurons, would allow these theropods to process spatial and tactical variables at a speed that borders on precognition. But the issue does not stop at simple tactical coordination. To maintain this level of social complexity, they require a communication protocol with an extraordinarily high bandwidth. Lacking the fleshy lips and complex vocal cords of mammals, their language would be fundamentally alien to our ears. They would likely utilize a sophisticated multimodal communication system. Vocally, they could generate infrasound, deep, low-frequency rumbles originating deep within their chest cavities, similar to modern cassowaries or elephants. These infrasonic waves can travel for miles through dense forests or across open plains without degradation, allowing scattered packs to maintain constant contact. Visually, they would exploit their complex plumage by utilizing microscopic structures within their feathers to manipulate structural coloration. Combined with precise muscular control over their crests and tail fans, they could flash highly specific, instantaneous visual codes. Their language is a synchronized dance of seismic rumbles and iridescent flashes, capable of conveying abstract concepts like time, distance, and specific threat categories. Armed with this immense cognitive and communicative framework, These creatures inevitably cross the threshold into active environmental manipulation, tool use. While they lack the human hand, the Maniraptoran anatomical blueprint provides highly dexterous, three-fingered forelimbs armed with precise articulating claws. Combined with a robust, highly sensitive beak, they possess all the physical hardware necessary to manipulate objects with extreme precision. We observe this today in New Caledonian crows, which meticulously carve hooks from twigs to extract larvae. Scaled up to an animal the size of a leopard, this capability expands exponentially. They do not merely use found objects. They actively fabricate soft technology. They might weave complex snares from tough vines, utilize sharp stones to crack open heavily armored prey, or systematically strip bark and foliage to construct highly sophisticated, multi-chambered communal nesting structures. They are engineers of the biological realm, manipulating the forest canopy and the soil without ever leaving a geological scar. And precisely here, this biological reality connects with a much larger question regarding the Fermi paradox and the search for extraterrestrial intelligence. When our radio telescopes scan the galaxy for signs of advanced civilizations, we are exclusively looking for technosignatures, the atmospheric accumulation of industrial pollutants, the unnatural heat radiation of megastructures, or the narrowband emissions of radio transmitters. We inherently assume that extreme intelligence inevitably leads to industrialization. However, the model of the highly advanced, tool-using theropod challenges this fundamental assumption. What if the universe is teeming with high intelligence, but industrialization is a catastrophic anomaly? A species that is perfectly adapted to its environment, heavily insulated against the cold, and armed with lethal natural weapons, has absolutely no biological incentive to harness fire. Without the controlled application of fire, there is no metallurgy. Without metallurgy, there is no radio technology. A species could possess a rich, complex culture, deep social lineages, and advanced mathematical understanding of their environment, yet remain completely invisible to our deep space observatories. It suggests that a soft-tech civilization, one built entirely on biodegradable tools and ecological manipulation, might be the absolute standard for sapience in the cosmos. If true, the Great Filter is not a barrier to intelligence itself, but rather the highly specific, incredibly rare environmental pressure required to force an intelligent species to strike a flint and burn its world. On this uninterrupted Earth, the advanced theropods represent the apex of this soft-tech paradigm. They are the undisputed cognitive sovereigns of the Cenozoic, silently orchestrating the flow of the biosphere with a lethal, calculated grace. They leave no plastic in the soil and no radiation in the ice, perfectly integrated into the planetary machine. Yet, while their intelligence perfectly balances the predator-prey dynamics of the surface, the immense biological machinery of the animals they hunt is operating on a scale so vast that it transcends biology entirely. Deep within the digestive tracts of billions of colossal herbivores, an invisible microscopic process is quietly generating a chemical output so massive that it threatens to fundamentally rewrite the atmospheric chemistry of the entire planet. Deep within the digestive tracts of billions of colossal herbivores, an invisible microscopic process is quietly generating a chemical output so massive that it threatens to fundamentally rewrite the atmospheric chemistry of the entire planet. The vast herds of ceratopsians and titanosaur descendants do not merely consume the flora, they operate as mobile, multi-ton bioreactors. To break down the tough cellulose of the global grasslands, they rely on enteric fermentation, a highly complex metabolic process driven by trillions of symbiotic, methanogenic archaea residing in their gut. The inevitable biological byproduct of this ancient alliance is methane gas. While carbon dioxide receives the majority of the attention in modern climate discussions, methane is a profoundly more aggressive thermodynamic agent. On a molecular level, methane absorbs thermal infrared radiation vastly more efficiently. Over a 20-year period, it traps roughly 80 times more heat in the Earth's atmosphere than an equivalent mass of carbon dioxide. When you scale this biological exhaust up to a planetary level, accounting for tens of millions of gigantic dinosaurs weighing several tons each, the numbers become mathematically staggering. Current paleontological models suggest that even in our actual timeline, Mesozoic sauropods produced hundreds of millions of tons of methane annually. In this uninterrupted Cenozoic era, with mega herbivores aggressively expanding across the new, silica-rich plains, this output would be vastly magnified, effectively weaponizing the carbon cycle. At a planetary scale, the meaning of this changes completely. The dinosaurs cease to be mere inhabitants of the Earth. They become a dominant geological force dictating its climate. As the shifting tectonic plates and cyclical orbital mechanics attempt to plunge the Earth into a deep, permanent ice age, the collective digestive exhaust of the dinosaurian biosphere actively pushes back. They create an immense artificial biological greenhouse shield. The methane acts as a planetary thermal blanket, trapping enough solar radiation to keep the advancing glaciers at bay. The biosphere literally digests its way out of a planetary freeze, locking the Earth into a suspended, highly volatile state of semi-glaciation. But the issue does not stop at simple thermal buffering. Methane is highly reactive in the upper atmosphere. It is constantly bombarded by solar radiation and reacts violently with atmospheric hydroxyl radicals. Over a period of about a decade, this methane oxidizes, breaking down into carbon dioxide and water vapor. This injection of water vapor into the stratosphere is critically important. It forms high-altitude ice clouds that further trap thermal radiation, creating a compounding greenhouse effect. However, because methane degrades so quickly compared to carbon dioxide, the Earth's temperature becomes entirely dependent on the continuous daily output of the dinosaur herds. This creates severe, localized climate instability. The Earth does not experience a smooth, consistent temperature profile. It is subjected to violent, rapid microfluctuations. If a virulent disease or a severe drought temporarily reduces the herbivore population, the planetary methane output plummets and the Earth rapidly cools. When the herds recover, the methane spikes and the planet aggressively warms. Massive superstorms, fueled by this constantly shifting atmospheric energy, ravage the coastlines, while sudden intense droughts scorch the continental interiors. The mega herbivores are trapped in an endless migration to chase the shifting rainfall, effectively forced to run from the very weather patterns their own digestion created. And right here, this specific atmospheric chemistry begins to connect with a much larger question regarding the search for extraterrestrial intelligence. When astronomers and astrobiologists use advanced space telescopes to analyze the atmospheres of distant exoplanets, they search for chemical disequilibriums, gases that should rapidly destroy each other and therefore should not exist together unless something is actively producing them. A planet exhibiting high levels of both oxygen and methane is widely considered the holy grail of atmospheric biosignatures. However, if this dinosaurian climate model is accurate, it introduces a terrifying complication for the search for extraterrestrial intelligence. We might point our telescopes at a distant star, detect a massive pulsing methane anomaly, and confidently assume we have found an industrialized alien civilization rapidly warming its planet with fossil fuels or agricultural engineering. But the reality could be vastly different. We might not be looking at a technological utopia or a spacefaring civilization approaching the Great Filter. We might simply be looking at a world utterly dominated by alien mega-herbivores, a planet held hostage by the digestive processes of a hyper-successful, entirely non-technological biosphere. It reminds us that the line between a biological planetary engine and an industrial one is chemically razor-thin, vastly complicating our ability to distinguish a world of beasts from a world of machines. This biologically mediated climate trap effectively paralyzes the global morphospace. Because the extreme megafauna buffer the planet against a total freeze, the ecosystems never experience the complete collapse and subsequent reboot required to open up radically new evolutionary niches. The dinosaurs maintain their absolute unyielding monopoly over the terrestrial energy flow. And this leads to a deeper, more profound consequence. In our timeline, it was the chaotic, violently shifting climates of the Cenozoic that fractured the deep forests, forcing early, highly adaptable mammals into the open, triggering the dawn of a new kind of intelligence. But on this chemically stabilized, hyper-competitive Earth, the evolutionary gaps are permanently sealed shut by methane and muscle, guaranteeing that the most vulnerable biological lineages are left completely without a path forward. The immense chemically stabilized climate and the absolute biological lockdown of the terrestrial surface create a profound evolutionary dead end for one specific lineage, the primates. In our actual timeline, the evolutionary path to humanity was paved by empty space. As the African continent tore apart along the East African Rift and the dense tropical forests slowly gave way to open savannas, our arboreal ancestors were forced to descend from the trees. They stepped into an environment that was dangerous, but crucially, it was not ecologically saturated. They found an exploitable biological vacuum. They could learn to walk upright, forage in the tall grasses, and eventually form complex hunting bands because the apex predators of the mammalian world were not fundamentally designed to suppress bipedal tool users. In this alternate Cenozoic era, that vacuum does not exist. The ground is a lethal, impenetrable fortress. If a primitive primate attempts to abandon the forest canopy and step onto the silica-laced grasslands, it immediately collides with the competitive exclusion principle. This foundational law of ecology dictates that two species competing for the exact same resources and ecological niche cannot stably coexist. One will always drive the other to local extinction. The early hominid body plan, a slow, awkward biped attempting to utilize rudimentary tools and group tactics, is hopelessly outmatched. The open plains are already entirely monopolized by the dromaeosaurid descendants. These highly encephalized feathered theropods have spent over 150 million years perfecting the exact niche of the agile, bipedal pack-hunting predator. For a fragile, newly grounded primate, survival is mathematically impossible. They are instantly eradicated, not out of malice, but through the ruthless efficiency of a superior biological machine occupying the exact same space. Because the ground is strictly off limits, the primate lineage is permanently exiled to the upper branches of the remaining forests. This creates an ecological trap known as an arboreal ceiling. Living high in the canopy imposes strict, non-negotiable limitations on biomechanical development. The primary constraint is gravity and the structural integrity of wood. A creature navigating thin branches cannot exceed a certain mass without constantly risking fatal falls. Because their body size is physically capped, their cranial capacity is similarly restricted. They can never develop the sheer volume of neural tissue required to match the cognitive processing power of the ground-dwelling theropods. But the issue does not stop at brain volume. It extends to the fundamental chemistry of human evolution. The defining leap of the human species was the mastery of fire. Controlled fire allowed our ancestors to cook their food, effectively outsourcing digestion to the environment. This external digestion provided the massive caloric surplus required to fuel the uniquely energy-hungry mammalian neocortex. However, mastering fire requires a stable, ground-based encampment. It requires the collection of dry fuel, the striking of flint, and the defense of a terrestrial perimeter. An arboreal primate, constantly moving through the wet, humid canopy to avoid climbing predators, simply cannot invent metallurgy or controlled combustion. Without fire, their caloric intake remains drastically limited. The biological ledger cannot be balanced. The emergence of a human-like intellect is starved out of existence by the thermodynamic limitations of a raw food diet in the treetops. At a planetary scale, the meaning of this biological suppression completely changes our perspective on our own existence. We tend to view the evolution of human intelligence as a grand, inevitable climax of biological progress. We assume that given enough time, any stable biosphere will naturally produce a technological, stargazing species. Yet, the permanent exile of the primates reveals a terrifying paradigm. Extreme ecological stability is aggressively hostile to the emergence of human-like intelligence. The evolution of humanity was not a consequence of biological optimization. It was a consequence of extreme ecological trauma. We exist entirely because a massive asteroid annihilated the optimized rulers of the planet, fracturing the ecosystem deeply enough to create a temporary, chaotic void. And right here, this hypothesis begins to connect with a much larger question regarding the Fermi paradox and the silence of the cosmos. When astrobiologists ponder the Great Filter, the theoretical barrier that prevents life from colonizing the galaxy, they frequently imagine technological self-destruction or planetary sterilization. But the fate of the alternate primates suggests a far more insidious filter: the filter of ecological perfection. If an alien biosphere never experiences a catastrophic Chicxulub-scale extinction event, its apex species will continuously refine their dominance until every niche is hermetically sealed. On millions of Earth-like exoplanets across the Milky Way, the local equivalents of our ancestors might be permanently trapped in their respective canopies, looking down at a world completely conquered by the perfect biological machines. The universe might be silent not because intelligence is rare, but because the necessary destruction required to give a vulnerable, tool-using species a chance to claim the ground is a statistical anomaly. In a perfectly balanced world, humanity never even gets the chance to stand up. When we observe this vast alternative timeline, a world where the Chicxulub impactor simply grazed the upper atmosphere and continued into the interstellar void, we are forced to confront the extreme fragility of our own existence. The human species, with all our technological achievements, our sprawling cities, and our deep space observatories, is not the inevitable climax of a biological master plan. We are the direct byproduct of a celestial accident. If the orbital mechanics of that 10-kilometer asteroid had shifted by even a fraction of a degree, the ecological vacuum required for our mammalian ancestors to leave the trees and master fire would never have opened. We exist only because the undisputed masters of the terrestrial biosphere were violently removed by forces completely outside the laws of biology. This realization dramatically alters how we must approach the Fermi paradox and the search for extraterrestrial intelligence. We inherently assume that given billions of years of stable evolution, any habitable exoplanet will eventually produce a technological civilization. But the uninterrupted reign of the dinosaurs suggests that prolonged planetary stability is actually an evolutionary trap. A perfectly balanced ecosystem, completely saturated by highly optimized apex predators, creates an impenetrable biological ceiling. The true Great Filter might not be the tendency of advanced civilizations to destroy themselves with nuclear weapons or artificial intelligence. Instead, the filter might be the sheer statistical unlikelihood of a planet experiencing the exact sequence of chaotic, localized extinctions necessary to repeatedly shatter the ecological hierarchy, allowing vulnerable, tool-using opportunists a chance to claim the surface. Without catastrophic disruption, the universe might be filled with lush, vibrant worlds permanently locked in a state of primitive, non-technological perfection. Yet, the ultimate irony of this massive thought experiment is that we do not actually need to imagine a world where the dinosaurs survived. We are already living in it. The Chicxulub impact did not erase the entire dinosaurian lineage. It merely acted as a ruthless thermodynamic sieve. The massive apex predators and the colossal herbivores, heavily reliant on a stable, high-calorie food web, were systematically starved out of existence during the prolonged impact winter. But one specific branch of the theropod family tree had already spent tens of millions of years adapting to the absolute margins of the ecosystem. By evolving small body sizes, highly efficient avian respiratory systems, and the ability to scavenge for seeds and insects in a collapsing biosphere, the ancient birds slipped right through the apocalyptic bottleneck. Today, there are roughly 10,000 distinct species of avian dinosaurs navigating the modern world. They inhabit every single continent, from the freezing coasts of Antarctica to the densest tropical rainforests of the equator. When a raven utilizes fluid dynamics to ride a thermal updraft, or when a falcon calculates the precise aerodynamic trajectory to strike its prey at over 200 miles per hour, we are not witnessing the behavior of a simple bird. We are watching the highly refined, unbroken continuation of the theropod lineage. They do not rule the megafaunal niches as their ancestors did, but their sheer diversity and cognitive brilliance prove that the biological architecture of the Mesozoic era never truly faded away. The great empire of the dinosaurs did not fall. It simply surrendered the ground, took to the skies, and quietly waited for the dust to settle.